So welcome to the 2025 Development in Action webinar. It's the first webinar of this year, and today's webinar is going to be on mobilizing private investments for climate adaptation for African countries. My name is Evangeline Aritwala, and I'm the Alumni Engagement Officer, and I'm pleased to invite the webinar speaker today, who is Commonwealth Alumnus Derek Apell. Derek is a 2014 Commonwealth Distance Learning Scholar from Uganda, and he completed his Master's in Poverty Reduction and Practice from SOAS, University of London. Derek is currently the lead coordinator of the African Finance Alliance on Climate Change, which is an initiative launched by the African Development Bank. And in his webinar today, he will talk about these initiatives by the African Development Bank. AFAC, which is the African Financial Alliance on Climate Change, is a voluntary network of financial institutions working together to tackle the challenges posed by climate change. Derek is an environmental economist with over 10 years of experience in economic policy analysis related to natural resources and the extractive sectors in East Africa. So today I'm pleased to invite Derek, and I am all ready to hear more about his work and this webinar topic. Derek, over to you.
Thank you so much, Eva. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, all loud and clear.
Fantastic. Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. By way of introduction, as Eva said, my name is Derek Apell, and my talk today is going to tackle the approaches for mobilizing private investment for climate adaptation from the narrow perspective of the African Development Bank. Before I begin, I think Eva had given some bit of background about my biography. I'll provide more details. So, as she said, I attended a distance master's in poverty reduction and policy and practice from SOAS between 2015 and 2021. Prior to that, I had attended a master's in policy economics from Williams College in Massachusetts, and a bachelor's in statistics from Makerere in Uganda. Sorry about that. In terms of experience, I like to think of my career in three distinct blocks. I spent the first 8 years of my working life as a statistician, generating official statistics on poverty. And then I worked for 5 years as a country economist, providing research-based policy advice to government officials in Uganda and Rwanda, particularly in the sectors of agriculture, energy, and mining. And then for the past 2 years, I've worked as a climate finance consultant in the Climate Change and Green Growth Department of the African Development Bank, where I coordinate an initiative known as the African Financial Alliance on Climate Change, which I will talk about later on in my presentation. In hindsight, I think I credit my poverty experience at the start of my career for revealing to me the connections between climate change and poverty, which motivated me to shift my career, first as a researcher and then as a practitioner in the climate space. So my agenda for this afternoon is I'll start my talk by giving a background of climate adaptation, what it is, implications for African countries, and why it is difficult to mobilize private finance for adaptation. I'll then highlight the approaches of the African Development Bank in mobilizing adaptation finance with 3 case studies. And then I'll conclude with some personal reflections on what more can be done in the climate space, specifically for adaptation, and also give some insights I've gained along the way and how my Commonwealth Master's Fellowship prepared me for it. So starting with adaptation. So by climate adaptation, I'm referring to actions to prepare and adjust to climate impact, both now and in the future. So climate adaptation is distinct from climate mitigation, which refers to actions that slow the pace of climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So then why do we need to adapt to climate change? Well, atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases measured in parts per million of carbon equivalent have nearly doubled in the last 300 years. And higher concentrations of carbon in the atmosphere have created a greenhouse effect whereby the surface temperatures on the Earth have risen by nearly 1.2 degrees in the last 300 years. And what we're seeing around the world today is an increased frequency of extreme weather events, disrupted natural ecosystems, and rising sea levels. So there is reliable evidence from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC for short, that attributes the growth in emissions to human activities, especially the burning of fossil fuels. But also, it attributes the growth in concentrations of carbon in our atmosphere to the warming of the surface temperature of the Earth that we see today, and also attributes the warming of temperatures to the physical impacts that we see today in terms of disruption to ecosystems and extreme weather events. And unfortunately, even if emissions were to fall to zero today, temperature would still continue to rise for several years, simply because of the time it takes for greenhouse gases to chemically decay. And so for those reasons, adaptation is paramount. So what does this mean for African countries? To start with, African countries did not cause climate change. In fact, only 3% of historic emissions, that is cumulatively, are attributable to African countries. However, African countries are at the front line of the climate crisis. In fact, they face high exposure to climate impacts, and yet they have limited resources to deal with those impacts. The Climate Risk Index, which I'll show later, shows that 5 out of the world's 10 most vulnerable countries are on the African continent. Now, African countries have taken a proactive step to combat climate change, both adaptation and mitigation. 53 out of the 54 countries on the African continent have ratified the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. This is except Libya. So the Paris Agreement is just a treaty which was signed in 2015, in which countries made legally binding commitments to adapt and mitigate climate change. So each country's commitments are articulated through nationally determined contributions, or NDCs for short. I'll be using the word NDCs a lot throughout this presentation. If you do not know what NDCs are, just know that, think of them as national action plans for climate. So at present, 45 African countries have submitted their NDCs to the UNFCCC, which is the UN body that is responsible for compiling NDCs. And the budget for Africa's NDCs is about 2.8 trillion US dollars between 2020 and 2030. So 2.8 trillion US dollars is equivalent to about 250 billion US dollars each year, or 16% of the GDP of the average African country. So to put that number into context, the average African country collects roughly 16% of its GDP in taxes, meaning that if African countries were to devote 8% of their GDP towards climate action, it would mean they would have to do so at the expense of other basic government functions, like providing security, healthcare, medicines, education, infrastructure, and so forth. However, the challenge is African governments are already fiscally stretched as it is. In fact, there is a looming debt crisis, IMF tells us. And that is why when you look at the NDCs submitted by African countries, the average African country expects 78% of the budget of its nationally determined contributions to be externally funded. Okay, so this slide here just maps the climate risk index, which I discussed earlier. So the climate risk index is a measure which takes into account how exposed a country is to extreme weather events. In other words, the frequency and intensity of different events, how vulnerable it is in terms of the human and economic costs to those extreme weather events that it faces. So it ranks countries from high vulnerability to low vulnerability. So on this map here, you can see the darker shaded regions are the most vulnerable. And they tend to be concentrated on the African continent, South America, and South Asia. Okay. So on the right-hand side, we see that the 10 most vulnerable countries, of which 5 are in Africa. That is Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Malawi, South Sudan, and Niger. So then we move to Africa's adaptation challenge. When you look at the indices submitted by African countries, we see that financing or financing needs is skewed towards mitigation. In fact, adaptation is allocated only 24% of Africa's NDC budget. So then the question is, how is it that a region most affected by climate change can devote less effort to adaptation? My hypothesis is that the reason is twofold. One is that Africa is reliant on external sources of climate finance due to the limited financial capacity that I mentioned previously. Okay? So relying on external sources of finance means that African countries are at the mercy of the global trends in climate finance. That brings us to reason number 2. So at the global level, only 6% of climate finance is used for climate adaptation. And we see that in the left graph. Okay. Still on the left-hand side, you see that private and public finance are split 50-50 between in climate action. So what is not in this graph is that the private sector on the African continent contributes only 14% of climate finance. That is compared to 50% globally. The graph on the right shows the size of climate finance across the world and its sources, whether internal or external. So we see, first of all, that sub-Saharan African countries, which are third from the bottom in terms of size of climate finance, if you compare to other countries, if you compare to other regions, sub-Saharan African countries are heavily reliant on external sources of climate finance. And that is the light shaded bar on the right-hand side. Okay? And yet, when you total up the amount of international climate finance flows, less than 10% of international climate finance flows towards African countries. So I submit that the reason why African countries devote less effort towards adaptation is a combination of factors. One, budget constraints on the part of African governments, creating a reliance on external sources. Two, limited external flows of external finance towards African countries. And three, these external financing sources are skewed towards mitigation. And finally, there is limited involvement of Africa's private sector in financing climate projects, which creates a significant financing gap for climate adaptation and climate action more broadly. So the question is, why is it difficult to raise private financing for adaptation? So there are 3 reasons. There could be more, but this is how I'll summarize them. So first is that adaptation tends to be a public good. In other words, the benefits of climate adaptation accrue to society as an individual, as a whole, and not an individual. For example, if a wall is built to create a barrier between land and the ocean to guard against rising sea levels, okay, a private individual cannot charge a fee to the people on the land for using that wall. And so if he cannot charge a fee, he or she cannot charge a fee, there's no incentive for him to or her to invest. Second, there are no standard measures or metrics of progress in adaptation compared to mitigation, which is measured in reduction in carbon emissions. In fact, there is still considerable debate about how to quantify progress in adaptation. So if you can't quantify progress in adaptation, it's difficult to demonstrate to investors or lenders the return to their investment or your creditworthiness, for example, as a borrower. Third is a problem which is common to several African countries, the business environment in terms of macroeconomic stability, the policies, laws, regulations, and infrastructure, which is lacking in several African countries, and that limits the availability of investment-grade projects. So how does the African Development Bank look at these problems and address them? So to begin with, the African Development Bank is a multilateral development institution, development finance institution. This means that it primarily gets its funds from its shareholders, many of whom are African countries, and it invests these funds in the form of direct loans to governments or to non-government institutions, or through projects, and it receives an interest rate on these loans, which it then gives back to its investors. But then that interest rate is what we call concessions. In other words, it is less than what these countries would find on the private market. So African Development Bank is exemplary among other multilateral development banks in that it has set ambitious goals to help African countries mitigate against climate change and adapt to its impacts. And we see that in its 10-year strategy from 2023 to 2033, and that's available online if you want to read it. So, just a high-level summary of the targets in the bank strategy. It has committed to allocate 40% of its funds by 2033 towards climate finance. It has committed to ensure that all its projects undergo climate screening before being approved. In other words, climate will be among the feasibility criteria before a project is approved. In addition, all projects will be reviewed to ensure that they align with the Paris Agreement, that is, ensuring that they contribute or do not harm the Paris Agreement goal of promoting low carbon and climate resilient growth. Fifth, all regional and sectoral strategies by 2023 should include climate considerations as they are being made. And finally, the bank aims to mobilize 25 billion for climate finance for African countries, mainly through its role as an accredited implementing agency for international climate funds, such as the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, the Global Environmental Facility, and so forth. In fact, the bank has already achieved, and in some cases exceeded, some of these targets, such as the one on achieving parity. Actually, it's not in this slide. One of the targets that the bank has committed to achieving is parity between climate adaptation and mitigation. And so that target has already been exceeded. In fact, in 2023, 55% of the bank's financing went towards climate adaptation. And it was the first multilateral development bank to achieve that goal. So in addition to its own operations, the bank has what we call special initiatives. Special initiatives are projects that address critical barriers to private investments in climate in the climate space on a pilot basis. So the lessons learned from these from implementing of these special initiatives inform the scale up to a wider scale at the continental level. So today I'm going to speak about 3 special initiatives as case studies. That is the Africa Financial Alliance on Climate Change, Africa NDC Hub, the Africa and Africa Adaptation Benefits Mechanism. So I personally been involved in 1 and 2, while 3 I thought is especially relevant for a discussion on adaptation. Okay. So starting with African Financial Alliance on Climate Change, or AFAC for short, it's a voluntary network of financial institutions, that is banks, capital markets, insurance, and pensions, plus their regulators, that have agreed to collaborate on all things climate. So the African Development Bank hosts the secretariat of AFAC, which I coordinate on a day-to-day basis. So I just want to highlight one initiative of AFAC we're working on at the moment, which is a sustainable finance taxonomy for the financial sector. So a sustainable finance taxonomy is like a dictionary that classifies activities according to their contribution to Africa's sustainable and climate goals. So why do we need the taxonomy? Well, there's a lack of standard definitions of what sustainability means in an African context. So this leads to different sustainability claims by companies or traded funds that cannot be substantiated because there's no reference point. So this can result into greenwashing. So greenwashing is just the practice of making false sustainability claims with the intention of deceiving investors in order to make a financial return. Okay, so this reduces. So as I was saying, the lack of standard definitions for what counts as sustainability reduces investors' trust in sustainable financial products, making sustainably focused investments less attractive and resulting in underinvestment in both adaptation and mitigation by consequence. So what the taxonomy project is doing is that through comprehensive consultations, the project is forming a consensus on what sustainability means in an African context, how to measure it, and how to identify projects and activities or companies that contribute to the continent's sustainability and climate goals. So as a first step, the taxonomy will include sustainability criteria in the sectors of agriculture, construction, energy, manufacturing, and transport, which will later be extended to other sectors. So once the taxonomy is made public, all financial sector companies, we hope, will have a reference point to communicate to their investors about the extent to which their businesses meet sustainability criteria. And we hope that as investors worldwide are becoming more focused on sustainability, we hope that the taxonomy will induce competitive pressures between companies that will make them seek approaches such as issuing green bonds, issuing green loans, in order to be more sustainably focused. And this will translate into more sustainable investments on the ground, including climate adaptation. So the next special initiative is the Africa NDC Hub. So the Africa NDC Hub is a multi-stakeholder platform where 21 international development agencies have agreed to convene to coordinate their individual efforts to support African governments to develop effective NDCs by ensuring that each NDC has compelling bankable climate projects that will attract private investment. So why do we need the NDC Hub? So without a pipeline of well-developed bankable projects, African countries or adaptation projects in African countries will struggle to attract private investors. So the NDC Hub provides a platform for the 21 member international development agencies to coordinate their efforts, share best practices, and sometimes even collaborate in how they support African countries through technical assistance or through capacity building to develop effective NDCs and adaptation plans. So far, I think all African countries have been supported to develop their nationally determined contributions. And as we near the time for updating those nationally determined contributions, the NDC Hub will be on hand to support African countries to develop their updates. Okay, so with those plans in place, African countries will be in a better position to attract private investment or mobilize climate finance from multilateral climate funds such as the Adaptation Fund, GCF, GEF, and so forth. The last special initiative I'll talk about today is called the Africa Adaptation Benefits Mechanism, or AABM for short. And the Africa Adaptation Benefits Mechanism is it's an innovative mechanism of the African Development Bank that independently assesses and gives a certification to adaptation projects based on how much society will benefit from those projects being carried out. So recall that without standard metrics or indicators of progress in adaptation or success in adaptation, private project developers or people who develop private individuals that develop adaptation projects cannot demonstrate to investors or even to lenders how beneficial or how creditworthy they are. So the adaptation benefit mechanism comes in with an independent and credible assessment, quantifying the adaptation benefits of adaptation projects. And currently, it's in 5 African countries, that is on your right there. That is Uganda, Eswatini, Kenya, and Cote d'Ivoire. So once an investor has their certificate in hand, that certificate can then be presented to lenders or investors with the stamp of a reputable organization like the African Development Bank, which they trust, showing that that project will do what it will say, what it says it will do, and that certification then unlocks those funds, whether equity investment or debt financing for adaptation projects on the continent. So, as I conclude, all of these special initiatives and the other efforts of the African Development Bank are only a drop in the ocean compared to the financing needs of the African, the financing needs that will plug the adaptation gap for African countries. More can be done, and that is where you, as the Commonwealth Scholars Network, comes in. If you're here and you're looking for a thesis or research topic, I can give you 3 suggestions. One is how to quantify the benefits of adaptation in terms of the dollar benefit and the cost of inaction. 2, what are the most effective instruments for financing climate adaptation projects. And three, what indicators can effectively track progress and communicate this progress to the general public in a way that is compelling. Practitioners also have a role to play. Here, we're in dire need of more case studies on how to access adaptation finance. What are the different sources, those that we know, those that we don't know, and what are the best practices for accessing funds from those sources? Second, what is the ideal policy and regulatory and legal environment that would attract private investment into climate adaptation? So, in closing, I want to share my personal testimonial of how my Commonwealth scholarship prepared me to confront a few challenges of working in international development and specifically in climate. So firstly, I think as you might already know, the field of international development is prone to fads. In other words, fashionable ideas. So every once in a while, you will hear or read about this or the other brand new silver bullet that will solve all the problems in international development. I am deeply grateful for my training that I received through my Commonwealth Masters Fellowship, for equipping me with the tools to question the philosophy and the value systems that underlie each development approach, which has made me a more critical consumer of new ideas. Secondly, the climate space is highly multidisciplinary. If you work in climate, you're going to meet with scientists, you're going to meet with economists, you're going to meet with geographers, you're going to meet with lawyers, name it. So I owe it to my discussion group that I had during my Commonwealth Masters Fellowship, which had people from diverse professional backgrounds that helped me to appreciate the unique contribution each discipline brings to the table. Third, I found that international development is highly multicultural. You'll find people from all sorts of nationalities. So once again, I owe it to the discussion group from my Commonwealth Masters Fellowship, as well as my previous masters, which had people from all sorts of geographic backgrounds, which helped me to appreciate the beauty in diversity. With that, I'd like to thank you for your kind attention. And in the words of the late Henry Kissinger, do you have any questions for my answers?
Perfect. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. It was really great to hear more about your work and AFEX initiatives, including the Sustainable Finance Taxonomy and the Africa Benefit Adaptation Investments Project. It was a good end to the program where you shared your Commonwealth scholarship journey with the attendees, and also thank you so much for posing the questions for researchers and for practitioners on adaptation finance. I'm sure our scholars and alumni joining this webinar will have found this useful. I would like to begin with the Q&A session now. Thank you so much to everyone who sent their questions via the registration form. I would like to start with some of the questions from the list that we received in advance. And please also do share your questions in the chat box. I can see a few questions coming through in the chat box already. So Derek, if you are ready with the questions, can I begin with the first question? Perfect. You spoke about private sector, public sector. In your opinion, what are the best practices for engaging the private sector in climate change adaptations?
Thanks. That's a very good question. And because, as I said, because adaptation is challenging in that it is hard to earn from it directly, in other words, to collect revenue from it directly, we do see that in the case of financial institutions, the ones that I work with on a close basis, if they adapt their businesses to climate change, we will see greater climate adaptation investments on the ground. Let me give you an example. If a bank ensures that its lenders are not in high-risk zones, for example, areas that are prone to flooding or prone to cyclones, in other words, charges a different interest rate, the people on the ground will see that it is not advisable to put my house or my building in these areas. And so they'll either reinforce their buildings or they will move to other areas. So that is adaptation on the ground. So all of that to say that private companies do not need charity. As long as you demonstrate the benefits of climate adaptation to their bottom lines, they will act accordingly.
Thank you for responding to the question. The next question is on how can local and small civil society organizations working especially at the community level, at the grassroots level, helping to build resilience for climate change, how can these organizations have access to funding from donor partners such as the African Development Bank to support their work at the local level?
Thanks. Another good question. And that brings me to the point of opportunities. I think that came up a lot among the questions. So grassroots and civil society organizations that are working with communities, I think not only the African Development Bank, but other multilateral development banks have different financing windows that specifically target communities in different ways. It could be through hand-holding, it could be through matchmaking, it could be through technical assistance in developing projects. So I can, if for those that are interested, I can provide links after this call to the different funding windows that specifically benefit grassroots organizations.
That would be great. Thank you so much, Derek. And yes, we will come to the next slide later, where we will share with you Derek's email address. So please do feel free to, get in touch with Daryl, to connect with him and take discussions forward or ask any queries you might have later. I'm going to take the questions now from the chat box, just being conscious of time. There's a question from a current PhD scholar who's undertaking their research in chemical and process engineering. Their research is around mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions from petroleum refineries by introducing bio oil to them. They are asking a question: what effort do development partners put into research and development? Apart from withholding funds, how do development partners support already existing entities such as oil and gas companies to mitigate climate change? And it's a long question, and there are two questions in it. If you want, I can repeat.
That's a loaded question. Thanks for it. Let me see if I can address it in a satisfactory manner. So I think I understand the gist of the question in the sense that research and development is needed for fossil fuel-based companies to become less polluting. And so what are multilateral development banks like the African Development Bank doing to support research and development? Well, at the moment, I would say that there is a huge debate as to what the global transition means, especially for African countries that did not contribute a lot to climate change. A lot of development partners in the Western world have come out and said that they're not going to fund fossil fuel companies, regardless of what that benefit or what that funding is going to do. As the African Development Bank, our approach is not that rigid. I would say that while certain projects are off limit, at the moment, the criteria is that each project should demonstrate its alignment with the Paris Agreement goals of promoting low carbon growth. So as long as that criteria can be met, the project will receive funding from the African Development Bank.
There's so many useful information coming, Derek, and thank you so much. And this has been appreciated and acknowledged in the chat box as well. Once you do have a moment, please do go through the amazing messages that you have received in the chat box. I can still see two more questions. It's quite interesting, so I'm going to raise the question. The next one is on youth engagement. So youth seem to, are seen as change makers globally. What suggestion will you have for the governments at local and state level, as well as for the NGOs involved with working with indigenous youth in climate change adaptations? What suggestions would you have for governments and NGOs working with youth?
That's a tough question, but maybe if I could address it from the perspective of the African Development Bank. We've seen on the African continent is one of the youngest continents in the world, with several ingenious people developing different solutions, be they like M-Pesa in Kenya or name it. And they're very quick to, the youth are very quick to adopt emerging technologies, be it blockchain, be it artificial intelligence, and so forth. All they need is an opportunity. Okay, so the African Development Bank has an initiative, special initiative, which I did not present here. It's called Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, which has a Youth Adapt Challenge. So the Youth Adapt Challenge is an annual competition of youth-led SMEs, where the leading is the SME that presents the best pitch in terms of climate adaptation receives a grant of $100,000 capacity building and mentorship. And we've seen winners of the Africa Adaptation Acceleration, the Youth Adapt Challenge, go on to create green jobs in the countries in which they belong to. So all of that to say is that the ideas are there. All they need is just the opportunity.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that information. I hope, for scholars and alumni who are working with the youth or on a similar, field, please do check this information out if you find it useful. One last question, just being conscious of time. How can development partners mainstream gender in climate programs?
That's a good question and tough, because I'm not an expert in gender issues by any stretch of the imagination. But if it is anything like climate, there are established frameworks that guide evaluation of, at a micro project level, the extent to which each project contributes or harms gender. So at the very least, just turning attention of the project developer or a corporate entity that gender is important, that in its own will induce them to incorporate measures of success, of project success in gender terms. So just a simple aspect of disaggregating benefits by male and female that could then incentivize the project implementer to ensure that there is equitable benefits by gender. So those are just my 2 cents, even though I'm not a gender expert. Don't take my word for it. But frameworks, yeah.
That's absolutely fine, Derek. I would highly encourage our attendees, if you are working in gender mainstream as your area of work, and if you would like to share anything, please do take the opportunity to either type it out in the chat box, or maybe stay a few minutes and share that in during the post webinar networking session. With that, I would now like to come to an end of the, I would like to end the Q&A session. Thank you so much, Derek. I know we have attendees who are leaving the webinar soon. So first, if you could just go through to the next slide with your email address, in case people would like to get in touch, and note down your email address, and then we'll come to the key summary points. If you would like to get in touch with Derek, please do note down the email address, which I'm more than happy to share in the chat box as well. Perfect. All right. So I hope you had the time to note down Derek's email address. Please do get in touch with Derek. Derek is more than happy to connect with you and talk more about his work, and also just in general, if you would like to, if you like to ask any queries about the webinar presentation or his line of work, please do get in touch with him and connect with him. So with that, we can now move to the previous slide of the summary
Okay.
before we end
So
the webinar.
thank you so much, Eva. So if I've said a lot today, and if you forget everything that I've discussed today, I just want you to leave today with um, three takeaways. One is that the scale of Africa's financing gap, especially for climate adaptation, um, requires effort from all stakeholders. The African Development Bank is showing leadership by piloting innovative initiatives and showing ambitious commitments that other multilateral development finance institutions are following. I think Commonwealth Scholars Network, like yourselves, and practitioners have a role to play in addressing the outstanding questions, whether be it in research or in practice on the ground. Thank you for listening to me, and I look forward to interacting with you in the future.